Good evening, everyone. None of my panelists have yet arrived, and so I'm going to go ahead and begin. Hold on a second. We got one. All right. Here's Jordan. That's a help. Let's give him a moment to come aboard. Good evening, Jordan.
Hey there.
Seems only you and I are interested in this conversation. I'm glad.
Sorry, somebody late. I had a grocery store run, and right when I got there, it was empty, and I did a little more shopping than normal. When I got up to the front, it's like, oh my God, where did these people come from?
Well, at least we just leave well enough alone, and they do their business, and we do ours.
Exactly.
So okay,
had to wait.
Okay, so last week we were talking about prestige and how that's created, and certainly you and I now have developed a certain amount of prestige on this YouTube channel because people hear about us talking about Jung and other current events, and then they decide to come and listen to us.
Because we know how to have such a good time.
We have fun together. That we do. Okay, so the point is whether something is collective or individual. And in order for it to be individual, you have to have prestige. If you lose the prestige, you sink back into the collective and simply disappear with a giant sucking sound. and
that's both inner and outer. I mean, if you can't self-support, you can't receive support. I mean,
right,
because it becomes not trustworthy.
Right. Okay. And last week we talked a little bit about Krishnamurti. I just want to remind our listeners about that because what happened with Krishnamurti was that Annie Besant, who was the founder of the Theosophists, discovered him, and he had this giant aura around his head. And if you wonder what an aura is, just look at the way our images sometimes go together. Like you can see how on my head if I change my camera.
Yep. I'm kind of curious about this because it's like
you have, well, it's something like that, but it isn't that. That what we're talking about right now is a glitch in our background, but a real aura is very much like that, except it's often blue in color. It depends on what the background is, and sometimes if you have light background behind it, you'll see it in multiple colors. And the point is that our bodies actually exude energy far beyond our physical being. It isn't visible, but it's nonetheless there.
And and not to demystify it or anything, but I look at it as if you see a ship moving at a decent keel knots, and you look at the front and how the water is the wake in front and the wake in back and on the sides, and that feels to me to be a physical example of the energetic structure that happens. I mean, how often do you walk into a room and someone is there and you know exactly who it is, and it's just a matter of scanning the room and there they are. Well, whether it's pheromones or energetics, there's still that as you mentioned, the collective versus the individual. There's still that radio station, so to speak, running, I think, from all of us.
Right. So I want to just reread this paragraph 238, and keeping in mind that Krishnamurti, when he was 31, he had been built up since he was 10 years old to be the new Messiah by the Theosophists. And when he was 33, on his 33rd birthday, he was to be announced as the new Messiah officially. And it was announced. And then he got up to give his speech, and he said, "I'm nobody's Messiah. I'm just a guy, and I don't want any followers. Don't follow me."
Yeah, they tried to do the Dalai Lama method with him, and
yeah, something like that. Yeah, and you have to have the Dalai Lama going along with you in order for that to work.
right.
And yeah, actually, probably we could find. Let me just see if I can find here. Wait a minute. Krishnamurti announcement.
Yeah, if you don't have them going along, it's the Dalai Lally gagging.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay, I just want to see if, well, no, there's no picture of it in what I found so far. And oh, well. Anyway, there's a nice picture of him as a young boy, though. So I'm going to just share this on the screen for a minute. So here's Annie Besant, and here's Krishnamurti here next to her, and Krishnamurti's brother, who was also brought along by the Theosophists. And so they founded this Order of the Star in the East in 1911, and went along, and then he let's just see if there's here he is as a young man in the 1920s. He's quite an attractive young fellow, and you could sort of see some aura around him even in this photograph, because this is all light around here. That might be a reflection, but there you can see that the background is lighter here, and that's sort of
well, he has a very direct and calm presence too, which is, there's an unthreatened depth.
Yeah, I was actually hoping I would find
Fielder.
There was a picture of Krishnamurti on the day that he renounced that I found here. Here he is again. And sorry. Anyway, he was very popular, and as soon as he established that he didn't want to be the new Messiah, he was the new Messiah for the rest of his life.
Yeah, the humility brought it
right
upon him.
And so Dr. Jung actually says this in this paragraph. So I'm going to read this paragraph again, and then we're going to go on, because this part of the book, although it's dense, is really about what's happening on our computer screens, our television screens today, and in terms of the Ukraine Russia war. And so we need to be conscious of this now, and this is a good opportunity for us to get conscious. So here's paragraph 238. The importance of personal prestige can hardly be overestimated, because the possibility of regressive dissolution in the collective psyche is a very real danger, not only for the outstanding individual, but also for his followers. This possibility is most likely to occur when the goal of prestige, universal recognition, has been reached. The person then becomes a collective truth, and that is always the beginning of the end. To gain prestige is a positive achievement, not only for the outstanding individual, but also for the clan. The individual distinguishes himself by his deeds, the many by their renunciation of power. So long as this attitude needs to be fought for and defended against hostile influences, the achievement remains positive. But as soon as there are no more obstacles and universal recognition has been attained, prestige loses its positive value and usually becomes a dead letter. A schismatic movement then sets in, and the whole process begins again from the beginning. And somewhere here, I misread that. But the point for Putin now, as an example, is that he's reached the top of his prestige that he can achieve in Russia. And one thing is very clear, this man is never going to be able to travel freely outside of Russia again. And he's sort of maxed out where he can get to, in the sense that he controls Russia with an iron fist. But
well, and he's an example of that regressive dissolution in the collective psyche is a very real danger. And
Right.
I think that regressive dissolution in the psyche, it's one thing to be dissolved within yourself, to be overpowered by the unconscious or inner contents. But the regressive dissolution, that's basically one gets cut off from self and gets further and further away from self. They're carried along in the flood, and their own personal inner grounding is snipped, and more washes them out to sea, so to speak. And then what happens is they may be a great leader for a while, but they only have one gas tank. They're not continually refilling. And after a while, and we see it now, there's the dogmatic, the autocrat who begins to become a dictator because they start to believe their own lies because they've been in power for that many decades.
Right.
And there's a loss of self there. And sometimes,
well, and it's clear
go ahead.
It's clear that the Russian people as a collective have lost their sense of individuality. They think of themselves as Russian, and they're still looking back to Catherine the Great. And Helen Mirren did a great job on that miniseries. We watched the end of it the other night. And so she was a contemporary of George Washington. John Quincy Adams, the fourth president of the United States, became an ambassador to Catherine the Great when he was 14 years old, believe it or not.
Mm-hmm. And instead of his dad, right?
Right. And his dad put him in a carriage and sent him off to Moscow or probably to St. Petersburg to negotiate with Catherine. And that must have been quite an experience for the young man. But in any case,
well, I have to say too, I mean, beyond the sentimental connections to things like Catherine with the Russians still have a powerfully iconic history, not only in iconic sacred art, but even in, let's say, Novgorod, you get the
right, but it's always looking backward, and the creativity of the country has died, and nobody that I've heard about in the last 30 years was pointing out the fact that the oligarchs were just stealing all the money and putting them in 250-foot yachts or 500-foot yachts. And meanwhile, they weren't, in fact, upgrading their army and things like that.
And I will say, I'll take the counter position that their art has not died. It's the kind of thing where the propaganda machine makes it to where everything that's creative is almost underground. So
yeah, well, it surely is that.
We don't basically get their pre-Soho. The artist pioneered the real estate of Soho until, as artists do, then other people find it to be trendy and price the artists out of their own discovery.
Right, but as long as Putin keeps his thumb on the country, to me, it's just a gray country. It's just not attractive.
Well, you have to go looking for the
with
art.
the exception of the Hermitage and you go find the cathedrals, and true to what you were saying, the Russians had thought that they had stamped religion out of the system, and actually the communist Chinese have thought that too. And in point of fact, as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, all the big cathedrals were renovated within 3 years,
which is an astounding feat.
Right, astounding feat. And so the church, the psychic support of the church was needed, and it was there, but it was underground. And the result of that is you don't get creativity in your society, and that's the advantage that the United States has had that Russia hasn't had. Every country in the world has been exporting their best brains to the United States for actually for centuries, probably. And
well, you take some of their heavy metal influences. They had a huge heavy metal scene, and there was the woman band that got imprisoned. I mean, and the thing is, they were sensationally good, beyond talent and developed ability. And
right.
So also the Russians I've known through my life, in a sense, it's kind of like me growing up in the desert. The beauty is in the detail, and you have to realize they grew up in butt-ass cold, so they are hardened and they're slower to respond, but when they do, it's lightning. And it's the kind of thing where I find the beauty in the detail, where instead of putting, for example, my projected what is art on them, I kind of have to go looking outside of my expectations, because they would have these beauties that were so crisp and clear. I mean, I have to say they were very Dostoevsky, and you get a lot of things that are very hard and very concrete, but they have gems and inclusions that are different than, say, me, who grew up in a temperate climate.
Okay, we're not arguing that.
I just don't want to make. I want to make sure that our message is not that the Russian people are gray and gone. I think there's a cultural piece, like you said, with the thumb being held down. That's true.
The thumb is being held down on them, and so my point is that yes, the blooms will come through if the blooms don't keep getting stomped on, but you see them getting stomped on when you see people are getting arrested for demonstrations, for example. We need demonstrations because demonstrations tell us where our government has gone wrong. And
well, it's
we have
kind
to
of the
rethink things, right?
Yeah,
and if you can't rethink things, then you may have it down there with you, but you, in a country of 150 million people, it takes a long time to disperse again. And so even if the plug is pulled off of it and they're allowed to do things, it really becomes a problem. And
and I think your thumb being put down on feels that I can visualize that, on a single person. But what's interesting is I think the concept there, bigger, moving to society, is that old prank with your friend in the swimming pool when you stick your finger down the top of the snorkel and see how long it takes him to cough underwater. I mean, so because the oxygen's cut off. And that's what that thumb held down does. It cuts their breathing, literally, the society's breathing.
If there's no creativity, if people don't learn creativity coming up, then it takes a while for it to emerge. And so if I remember my time in the Marines, nobody was asking me to be creative. Okay, they were asking me to follow orders and to be precisely this and nothing else. Right? This is what you are. You're a Marine, and this is what we Marines do. We're a weapon of the President of the United States. Okay, that's what a soldier does. But still, even in the Marine Corps, and I didn't understand it back in my Logos days, back when I was active in the Marine Corps. And, you know, there were combat artists. There were guys that were painting pictures out there and painting pictures of events out in the field or battles and so on. And I never understood that. I couldn't, you know, at the time I didn't understand it. But now I understand it, because it is the flowers blooming and creativity blooming. But you know, that's all well and good in church on a Sunday morning. It's not so good in the battlefield. You don't want people being creative in the battlefield. But the problem is,
when you feel like you're in a plein air watercolor group in a park, and you've got, you know, magazines and rounds just rat-tatting off. It's not typically your peaceful painting in the park kind of situation.
I think most of those paintings were painted after the event.
Yeah.
But
yeah, you don't have a sniper hanging out totally hidden, and then someone up, you know, right next to him with the brush in the air. And
yeah, but also you have the problem of people not willing to speak up. You know, in the Marines, I used to have people coming to me and say, okay, I'll do anything you tell me to do, but please don't make me deal with the politics. And so if somebody noticed that, you know, we don't have enough weapons, or we don't have enough this or that, you know, they wouldn't feel the urge to come out and individually speak and say, hey, Lieutenant, we don't have enough rounds here. We got a problem. And so everybody waits until the lieutenant figures it out for himself, or the colonel figures it out for himself. And that's dangerous. And so we need people who can be personalities and can keep you in bullets, bandages and beans. Like Radar O'Reilly is a good example. Okay, he had a personality on that television program, and he always knew what the hospital needed at any given moment, and he was always there before you were there.
Right.
That's the ideal guy, right? You need those people. But if you don't have any staff NCOs, which apparently the Russian army doesn't, I never knew this, but you know, they have generals and they've got privates who are conscripts. Well, that's not a recipe for success. Because the staff NCOs are the shop foremen of the military. You know, the chiefs and the sergeants, and they're the guys that keep everybody going, keep the young people moving when they're worried, because they're far from the general usually. So
and also they carry the radar, to go back to the MASH pun, Radar O'Reilly, which that was a perfect name for him, because he was always ahead of everybody. Right. And it was the radar of the bigger picture movements of the forces, so that there can be the not flocking behavior, but mass movements of many, many components that are in unison and synchronized to, you know, play out that weather movement of people and equipment.
Right. Okay, so the issue that we're trying to talk about tonight, the essential issue, is the distinction between the individual and the collective. And I'm going to read the next paragraph in a moment, but I just mentioned one mean quote of Jung's, which a lot of people have seen, which is, you know, 100 very prestigious men in a room creates one blockhead. And why is that? The reason is that once you get into a group, it tends to become the group instead of 100 individuals. And so whoever's the natural leader is the one that emerges, and then everybody just says and they start to go along with it, and pretty soon, you've got a problem. You've got a group that doesn't think. It's a blockhead. That's what Jung said. So,
well, I think right on track with that too. That brings up, I think, the hyper importance of Jung bringing up the regressive dissolution in the collective, because in a bigger picture, that simple inclusion there indicates that the same problems exist in the collective as they do in your individual psyche. So if you're cut off from your psyche, you actually have less of a chance to self-deal with them.
Yeah. So, okay. So now I'm going to read this next paragraph, which is, this one isn't a page and a half long. This is a short one.
Yep.
And then the next one we're going to have to split up. But this one is, okay. So the distinction is between having personality and being just part of the collective. Okay. And so because personality is of such paramount importance for the life of the community, everything likely to disturb its development is sensed as a danger. But the greatest danger of all is the premature dissolution of prestige by an invasion of the collective psyche. Okay, so how does this happen? If somebody starts to criticize the church, let's say, and the church has created its own prestige, both historically and perhaps the local priest has been doing it for 30 or 40 years, but he either dies or retires, and that happens right when things start to fall apart in society. You have a real regressive danger. And that the example of that is in the French Revolution, where respect for the church fell away. And the mobs came into Notre Dame Cathedral and built this huge mountain there. And then they persuaded a prostitute to get up on top of this mountain with the French flag, and she was supposed to be the goddess of reason. And the significance of that was everybody had logos their way out of God, and they felt that they didn't need the priests anymore, and so they were being very disrespectful to the church and to the cathedral, and the result of that was that things started to fall apart in society, and they started chopping people's heads off with guillotines.
Well, and that's an example there. And you brought up before, the forces composed of generals and conscripts or privates, and then that's Mary Antoinette. Let them eat cake, and she's the general there, completely separated from then the mobs of masses that, regardless of their status in the caste system, are pretty much just the mob.
Yep.
And there's such a chasm between her, even her dress and theirs, but her attitude, let them eat cake. Well, really, that was
sure. I mean,
make some sugar, and it's like,
yeah. I mean, it's a good thing she didn't say that on Twitter. She would have lost her head a lot earlier.
Sooner, right? That's
right. And even Donald Trump, when he was in power, couldn't get away with that, although he got away with a lot of stuff. But so the greatest danger of all is the premature dissolution of the prestige by an invasion of the collective psyche. And so we saw that on January 6th, where the prestige of Donald Trump ended up devolving into this mob that, you know, a lot of people got pulled along on that. I'm sure they didn't expect that they were going to attack anybody or set up a gallows for Mike Pence, but nonetheless, they were there and they got pulled along by that mob that he whipped up. And so anyway, so
well, and actually the gallows is very important there because Mike Pence was the number 2. And so for the number 1 to promote, enhance, reinforce, and strengthen a group who he knew would do something like that, that's juvenile alpha behavior of cutting off the head of your second. The head of your second is the other head of your teammate. The third might need to go, the fourth, but the one right next to you, if you seed discontent and dissent, you basically have just written yourself off.
Yeah. So okay. So absolute secrecy is one of the best known primitive means of exercising this danger, taking it out. Collective thinking and feeling and collective effort are far less of a strain than individual functioning and effort. Hence, there is always a greater temptation to follow collective functioning, to take the place of individual differentiation of the personality. So let's suppose that you were a loyal American who served 20 years in the Army, let's say, and you were in that crowd for good reasons of your own, and you recognize that what you're about to do is not really what the founding fathers had in mind, but do you think that one individual could have stopped it? No way.
No, unless they had the kind of pre-prestiged voice to stand up that people would listen to.
Yeah, I mean, if people who had a pre-prestiged voice, like the Proud Boys and those folks, this man Stewart, those guys, okay, they had some prestige in a certain group, and because they were very clear about what they were doing, and it was only maybe 8 or 10 of them that were in that line trying to get into the Capitol, but because they were very clear, everybody else was clear that they would follow them. That's what happened.
Yeah, exactly.
Without thinking much about it. And nobody was going to stop that.
Well, the path of least resistance is to draft behind a leader, regardless of what they're doing. You know, it's like, so if you don't understand that, I mean, it's just a bicycle move
right.
to ride behind someone and there's less wind pressure because the leader is taking the brunt. That's why there go my people, I must follow them. Make sure that people understand what's going on with the headwinds.
Right. So once the personality has been differentiated and safeguarded by magical prestige, its leveling down and eventual dissolution in the collective psyche, for example, Peter's denial, occasion a loss of soul in the individual because an important personal achievement has been either neglected or allowed to slip into regression. And we're seeing that with Donald Trump now, where he can't get people to come out to his rallies anymore.
Right.
And so his power is sort of dissolved away. For this reason, taboo infringements are followed by draconian punishments, altogether in keeping with the seriousness of the situation. And so we are starting to see some pretty major sentences on the people that were involved on January the 6th. And you're going to see a lot more. It's going to be pretty brutal because they have to be knocked back in order to have society and civilization go on in this country. Otherwise, we'll have anarchy.
Completely. And I think that last sentence, it's worth reading again because
well, for this reason, taboo infringements are followed by draconian punishments, altogether in keeping with the seriousness of the situation. Well,
and one thing I see too, that the things after the December 6th, now we're a year away, or January 6th, we're a year away, plus year and a season almost. We see the draconian measures, say in Texas, with trans people. And then these people are often the ones talking about the founding fathers. And I'm like, for crying out loud, the founding fathers wore wigs and makeup. It's like a drag queen fest to sign the Declaration of Independence. So what's this hypocrisy? That, George Washington, John Hancock, they could wear wigs and makeup, but people can't now. Maybe drag queens are imitating the founding fathers. And in that sense, it gives them more credit.
Fair enough.
So, I mean, but that's that draconian measures that are, slipping into regression, because they're looking for people to punish because they don't have any substance, and instead they're basically sore losers. They can't just own up to the fact that we got crushed in that championship.
Yeah, or we got crushed in that election.
Right.
And I think that what's very interesting now, I was hearing on a commentary today on the radio that now that this guy Eastman had sued the committee trying to keep 101 of his emails secret, so not turning them over, and the judge that said no to that said no way, it's probable that the president committed, crimes here, and this was a coup in search of a legal explanation, right? And then there was this other piece of that where one of Trump's own advisors about the Georgia thing kept telling him in the White House, and he testified to this already with the committee. He said, I told him multiple times that we checked all these conspiracy theories and none of them were true. And so we're not going to press forward on something that's not true. And Trump just said, well, what have I got to lose? Let's just go ahead and do it. Well, he's got a lot to lose, including his freedom. And
well, it shows how he did business. I mean, when most any billionaire that's interviewed doesn't consider Trump prosperous or rich. I mean, take a man who uses bankruptcy as his primary tool. I think back in, was it? It had to be around 92 or to 96. I'm not sure, but I think he took $1 billion loss. So I was laughing the whole time. People were saying he wasn't paying his taxes. At that scale, he probably went on a payment plan and didn't know taxes until 2024 in a recovery kind of program that level of business can afford to receive from the IRS. And that's not anything illegal. That's above board. But the problem is it comes across as so terribly convictive of the fact that he can't deal with substance in business. He has to deal with smoke and mirrors, cloaks and daggers. And it's got to be this childish drama of, let's go. What do we got to lose? Let's use the lie. Because what if we win? I mean, the manipulation there is, one, it's so amateur, but two, it's so detrimental because people who actually believed him were duped too.
And hurt badly.
Yes, and hurt badly. So I feel for them too, and I won't go into ignorance or this because that's just a point of perspective. I'm not going to play I'm always right or I'm right or what have you. They have their perspective and they have their reasons. And the First Amendment gives them that right. and it's a
Right.
cultural right. But yeah, they were hurt horribly.
Well, just think of all the croupiers in Atlantic City,
Oh yeah.
among others. Okay, so long as we recognize these things from the causal point of view as mere historical survivals and metastases of the incest taboo, it is impossible to understand what all these measures are for. If, however, we approach the problem from the teleological point of view, much that was quite inexplicable becomes clear. Okay, so if we look at Donald Trump from a teleological point of view, which means that instead of him, being a good guy and an effective businessman, instead of that causality, he's going to, he just wants to become the biggest person on the block. And
because teleological goes from a phenomenon perspective rather than a cause perspective, right?
Well, it goes from a, this is my objective. I don't care how I get there. Okay. And so my objective is to become, this super mogul. And so I'll just go ahead and do business in this cavalier way. And geez, if I have to declare bankruptcy, I'll go ahead and do that. And then people lend me money. Okay, that's a fact. People lend you money because you can't go bankrupt again for 6 years. And
I think, what is it? Was it 70 or 80% of the debt management assets with Trump were from Russian banks?
Right.
American banks, Chinese banks, they wouldn't give him a dime.
But Deutsche Bank would.
But Deutsche Bank would. But Deutsche Bank also has power. So
Deutsche Bank has power, but they're also pretty sleazy in many ways.
Well, I was going to say they play the loan shark on the scale of billions, and Trump is a perfect person to go pawn his pool cue, and get
that's right. And they did the same thing in India, and a lot of people lost money and the whole, they had their arms up to their necks and the crash of 2008, but that's a different topic.
Well, and that brings up the old joke. I'll switch it to them. What happens when you have that kind of banker up to their neck in crap? And it's like the answer, of course, not enough crap.
Yeah. And I have to acknowledge, okay, because there's always a dark side, that a business partner of mine, before he joined my company, but I'm not saying he didn't do this in our company, but before he joined our company, he was working for somebody else, and they owed, I think it was Bank of America. It was down in Charlotte. They owed him $200 million, and he was called in, and he had to explain where the collateral was, and I need, we need for you to make some payments on the collateral or on the loans. And he goes and says, well, no, actually we can't pay the loans, but so therefore a loan is 400 million. And then, you won't be bankrupt and we won't be bankrupt.
Doubling their leverage debt.
Right.
Which is an asset to them. That's okay.
Right. So they give them double the money, and he puts part of the money into the payments that he owed. Right. But he's got more money to work with. And this is exactly what.
Yeah. And that's the leverage debt game. Yeah.
Yeah. And it works. Okay, so
oh boy, this next paragraph must be going to take the place of my new favorite. It's like,
well,
it's a full 2 pages long.
This is a 2-page long paragraph.
Yeah.
I don't know how I can deal with that, because I think I was showing you the way I split up paragraphs with colors the other day. This would be too much to handle.
Yeah, you got to pull out the 64 crayons with sharpener for this paragraph, or the 128 Prismacolors.
Right. Okay.
Well, shall I?
Yeah, if you want to. When you get to a logical stopping place, go ahead and start.
Yeah, I'll pause so we can, because I think really in this one quote unquote Jungian thought will probably be a chorus of ideas. So when I get to a pause point, for the development of personality, then strict differentiation from the collective psyche is absolutely necessary, since partial or blurred differentiation leads to an immediate melting away of the individual in the collective. There is now a danger that in the analysis of the unconscious, the collective and the personal psyche may be fused together with, as I have intimated, highly unfortunate results. These results are injurious both to the patient's life feeling and to his fellow men, if he has any influence at all in his environment. Through his identification with the collective psyche, he will infallibly try to force the demands of his unconscious upon others, for identity with the collective psyche always brings with it a feeling of universal validity, God-likeness, in quotes, which completely ignores all differences in the personal psyche of his fellows. I think that's a point right there of pause, because it goes back to that regressive dissolution of, the man barnacle basically onto the collective, or the person barnacle.
Yeah.
And then that collective rolls away with their identity.
Right. And what I can give the example of a Marine who retires after 25 years, and he's bought in on the collective of being a Marine all this time, and he no longer has any individuality whatsoever. And so he retires, and he no longer has his role in the Marines. So he's basically done. Okay. And he can live on Marine Corps retirement pay, and maybe that's enough to get by on. But he also turns to this godlikeness and treats his household like a Marine Corps platoon or company or squad. And you see this in The Great Santini, for example, in that movie, where he's treating his kids like they're privates in the Marine Corps. And the result is not real favorable for the kids and the family. And it's kind of abusive for his wife as well. And yet he's a hero, because at the end he gives up his life for a town or something.
Well, and that brings up the point too of the natural difficulty of professional athletes retiring, because they're going from high adrenaline, high performance, high octane, go, which is pretty much Marines. You've got an intense environment on the playing field or on the battlefield. And what happens is, it's not unnatural for them to experience performance anxiety, simply because they have to start over. Right. Are they going to be a spokesperson on the news? Are they going to be a sports commentator? Okay, then they can kind of slide over into that seat. But that's not all of them. Those are the ones that had, the intellect going along with the arrows of the sport, and their intelligence is such that they can communicate in public on TV like that.
Sure.
But there's a point where, are they going to go into real estate business? Are they going to get a job, or are they going to invest in day trade? I mean, there's so many different things, but in essence, they're taking themselves from a place up here, and they would naturally want to stay up here. So they want to jump up here somewhere else. But when they do, it comes falling down like dominoes. You've got to start at the bottom.
Right. Well, I remember a quarterback that we had in high school, And he was, boy, God's gift to the women. He was very handsome, and he was strong, and he was effective, and we won the high school championship. And then he went on to Notre Dame and did very well at Notre Dame, but as a linebacker. And he stayed a linebacker in the NFL for 10 years. Okay. And when I saw him then when he was 30, and I went to a dinner for him at my old high school, boy, he was just done. You know, I just couldn't believe that he was so shallow, and there was nothing left for him in his life. You know, now that he's out of the professional football because he's 30 years old, and you can't cut it when you start getting a little older.
Well, the movie North Dallas 40. I mean, the scene where when he gets out of bed in the morning, and it's an event, like a half an hour event just to get out of bed.
Mhm.
And then his girlfriend or love of the time or the evening sees his hands, and they're like a gnarly tree. They're broken every which way but loose. They still work, but they're literally gnarled roots, and they're not fingers anymore. And you just notice at that point the terror that he has endured on the body that's not going to go away anytime soon, if ever. And
Right.
without anything inside, you know, there's not a whole lot left to do.
Okay. There's no good time to stop to answer this question that Emil has put on the YouTube. So we're just going to go ahead and stop and answer the question. And Amelia, I'm not actually going back to the paragraphs you mentioned, but I want to try to answer the question. Question is, I have a question about paragraphs 97, 102, and 110. Transference is not the same as projection, but does projection play a role in transference? It surely does. Okay. And transference is when, for example, my mother dies and my mother-in-law lives in the apartment next door to us, and so she's in my life regularly, and I start treating her like my mother. So I've transferred the mother-son relationship to my mother-in-law that my mother used to hold for me. And you know, there is some projection in that, but I don't see my mother-in-law as my mother. That my mother and my mother-in-law are completely different people. My mother-in-law is someone who will be very happy if she leaves her lifetime with no ripples. And my mother was the exact opposite. Boy, she wanted to be a hurricane. But my feeling toward my mother-in-law after my mother was gone did transfer some aspects of feeling like she was my mother. And that is a transference. It's because we have a need of certain of these archetypes in our lives. Mother is probably the most definite one. And so if that person isn't there, you tend to fill it in some other way.
And I'd respond to Emil also from 92, from paragraph 97, 102, 110, when back in that point. Projection is often too when someone triggers you to remember something that's familiar to what they are saying or doing. And so it pops up a similar situation for you to literally to project. The problem is when you project it at someone rather than project to someone, at that point, it almost is not projection, it becomes communication. Then that's a little more evolved, but sticking with the projection, it's often things that are pulled out that are similar in structure or stature, but the transference is then the wholesale taking of the whole structure of where that came from and taking it out of yourself and putting it on someone else. So in a sense, a boat with several ropes, attaching to the dock, the whole boat has now become part of the dock, and even though it's different, and I think that's a way to look at it. I think as Jung says, there's magic in projection, and that's when someone can see the thing within them brought outside. Then if the person they're interacting with doesn't take it personally and is unthreatened, can allow them to keep it outside and then see it from outside. And that makes it easier to have a third person outside perspective on yourself. The problem is, for example, in an argument between people, and people start firing the cannonballs of projection, and they're hurtful. And they do strike chords that resonate with what the person said that triggered them, but there is no actual responsibility. But the thing is, people start to then feel bad in a way, or ashamed, because I felt that too, and you put it out on me, and then they take it. So there's this kind of codependency that happens. That's not so much the magic, but I think projection just in general is when another similar thing sparks your psyche to put something out, to expel something as a communication, whether it's positive or negative. But the transference is then the whole thing transferred. It's no longer with you. You're putting that whole role, for example, Skip's mom on his mother-in-law.
Right. And let's give another example. I think everybody knows what my anima projection is. And because I've shown the image of my mother when she was 18 enough times, so everybody can probably visualize that at this point. But the point is that, okay, that was someone very special to me, obviously, when I was growing up, when I was a little boy. And what I learned or experienced through my early adulthood was that when a woman came along that pretty much matched that frame of my mother, with the long brown hair and the dark eyes, basically she framed her head with the long brown hair. Well, both of my wives have had exactly that. And so obviously so this image of your mother is very likely, your anima image is likely an image of your mother. And then that's your idea of a perfect woman. And so you project that onto an actual woman. And oh, by the way, she's not that at all. Maybe,
right?
Maybe, and so you go through this honeymoons period where you think, "Wow, I'm with my mother." I mean, unconsciously, you're doing this, right?
Right. It's not incestual, exactly.
Yeah, that's honeymoon. But then after about 9-10 weeks, you wake up and your wife is snoring in bed. And you say, is this the perfect woman I thought she was, type thing. And then you have to learn to live with the actual person you've married. And it works for women the opposite with the animus, of course. And so that's a projection. That's a projection of the anima. But that's not a transference. A transference is where you literally see the other person as something else. Okay,
right.
So for example, Jung got onto this when he realized that his patient was seeing him as her father. And he realized she was seeing him that way. And he ultimately said to her, I'm not your father. And you're going to have to learn to live without your father, but I care about you.
Right.
I definitely want you to come every week and pay your $150 an hour. Or whatever it was in those days. But and could my mother-in-law convince me not to have transference to her? Probably not. Because she lives with us. She's part of our family group. Basically, I mean, she's literally in another apartment, but she often has meals with us and so on. And so, I behave toward her the way I would behave toward my mother. And
that's natural because it's a family structure. And when say an elder in a family structure, a medicine woman, medicine man, chieftain, mom, dad, passes, dies, well, then naturally that hole is going to get filled. And what's interesting is it doesn't always have to. Sometimes there is, just leave the void empty, leave the space there and respect it. But like you're saying, there's a natural evolution of the family's continuation by that transference of just the roles and responsibilities.
So Nick has appeared.
Hey, Nick.
A lot of silence from Nick lately, so it's good to see you, Nick, and Nicholas. So bring, what was it? Shoot, I forget the name he was using when we first met. Uncle Buck. He used to call himself Uncle Buck. And
nice.
And so we've been missing you, Uncle Buck. Come on back.
Definitely.
I'm still saddled with this book you gave us to read. Only halfway through, so you need to come back and help us with it.
Well, speaking of which, shall we continue to?
Yes, go ahead.
Paragraph.
Proceed.
In parentheses, the feeling of universal validity comes, of course, from the universality of the collective psyche, close parentheses. A collective attitude naturally presupposes this same collective psyche in others. But that means a ruthless disregard not only of individual differences, but also of differences of a more general kind within the collective psyche itself. As, for example, differences of race. There's a long footnote here, so I think it's important we read that too. Footnote 8.
Well, let's read that as a separate item because that's a big, complicated thing. Go ahead. Just go ahead with.
Okay. This disregard for individuality obviously means the suffocation of the single individual, as a consequence of which the element of differentiation is obliterated from the community. The element of differentiation is the individual. At all the highest achievements of virtue, as well as the blackest villainies, are individual. The larger a community is, and the more the sum total of collective factors peculiar to every large community rests on conservative prejudices detrimental to individuality, the more will the individual be morally and spiritually crushed. And as a result, the one source of moral and spiritual progress for society is choked up. Naturally, the only thing that can thrive in such an atmosphere is sociality and whatever is collective in the individual. Everything individual in him goes under, i.e., in essence, is doomed to repression.
Right.
The individual.
Which is basically what we're seeing in Russia.
Yes.
Where we have one of the biggest collectives, namely the Russian people of 150 million people. And everybody is repressed.
Right.
More or less everybody.
Definitely. So the individual element lapse the individual elements lapse into the unconscious, where by the law of necessity, they are transformed into something essentially baleful, destructive, and anarchical. Socially, this evil shows itself in the spectacular crimes, regicide and the like, perpetrated by certain prophetically inclined individuals. But in the great mass of the community, it remains in the background and only manifests itself indirectly in the inexorable moral degeneration of society. It is a notorious fact that the morality of society as a whole is in inverse ratio to its size. For the greater the aggregation of individuals, the more the individual factors are blotted out, and with them morality, which rests entirely on the moral sense of the individual and the freedom necessary for this. Hence, every man is, in a certain sense, unconsciously a worse man when he is in society than when acting alone, for he is carried by society and to that extent relieved of his individual responsibility. Any large company composed of wholly admirable persons has the morality and intelligence of an unwieldy, stupid, and violent animal. The bigger the organization, the more unavoidable is its immorality and blind stupidity. Senatus bestia, senatoris bone viri. Society, by automatically stressing all the collective qualities in its individual representatives, puts a premium on mediocrity, on everything that settles down to vegetate in an easy, irresponsible way. Individuality will inevitably be driven to the wall. This process begins in school, continues at university, and rules all departments in which the state, capital S nation, has a hand. In a small social body, the individuality of its members is better safeguarded, and the greater is their relative freedom and the possibility of conscious responsibility. Without freedom, there can be no morality. I think that's a good stopping point.
Yeah. Right. So where nobody's allowed to speak in Russia, the natural morality of the Russian people, which might be informed by their religion, can't come forward because Putin puts his thumb on it immediately and puts people in jail. Even if it's for a short time, it just represses the society. And so we have the young woman who bravely showed the sign on Russian TV, Channel 1. She wasn't thrown into the Huskow for 10 years like Navalny. She was only basically given a warning, but she knows that if she does it again, she might well end up in a work camp.
Well, that, and then if I flip that over to our side of the pond, our civil warring factions, and this paragraph speaks directly to that, where people get so engrossed in sociality, social media, the things on the surface. So in a sense, they come out of the shell of themselves, and they'll post, "I brushed my teeth," or, "Oh, it's amazing, I took a nap and I woke up and I didn't remember my dreams." It's like, wow, I brushed my teeth, I used deodorant. These things become superficial, and I think that's going with the morality goes away, and it's in inverse to the size. The larger the society, the less the morality, because as he says, the individual components get stomped out.
Right. So there's a little conversation going on over here with Clara Hodel. He says, y'all might enjoy a recent podcast with Troy Cross and Nathaniel Harmon. He's in Hawaii and had an awesome first podcast about climate change and how ocean thermal energy with Bitcoin turns sea to a solar panel. Okay, well, Bitcoin as Torah Sabi course, but he says, is Mother Earth a spouse or a parent? And I responded, mother, and as alchemists, and as the alchemists say, was what I wanted to say. And so then he says, are we co-authoring with the world, planet, community, or ourselves as reflected, or neither? And I said both. We're co-authoring ourselves and the world and God.
And I think it's important in that co-authoring to understand that that does not imply collaboration, because
Yes.
collaboration implies an agreement between two people. And
Right.
just because I did something doesn't mean you get to own it. Just as you did something, I don't get to own it either. I mean, so there's the co-authoring, and we hope we'll author in parallel, but there's
Right.
not necessarily a collaboration. Just like correlation does not necessarily equal causation.
Yeah, and so then Turp says, seems like each transcends mother into child and significant other, all at a price indefinitely as it regards the planet. All at once indefinitely as it regards the planet. Well, yeah, we're co-authoring the human experience. There's no doubt about that.
Well, and I think that's a good question, but prior about, is the Mother Earth a spouse or a parent? And very definitely not a spouse, because that would be inflation. We're pretty small in regards to the Earth, and we do have an influence. But at the same time, it's our home.
Right.
It's not edible to not leave Earth. I mean, but it's the kind of thing where in that context, Earth is home, and that vesseling is a pretty natural thing to have there. So I would then put parent, but even so, it's more than parent. This is the caretaker of life, and how we take care of it, I think, indicates how we take care of ourselves.
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of people don't understand how fragile it really is, because if you look at a sidelong image of the atmosphere, it's only about 20 miles thick before you're dying. You're dying at 10,000 feet, which is 2 miles up. And by the time you get to 100,000 feet, you have no hope. And so
that's just like Everest. The last part of the climb is it's literally a race against not death. It's a race against dying, because you're asphyxiating basically, and
mhm.
you are from a certain point on the mountain to the top and back. You're dying.
Yeah, and so we are going to start valuing Mother Earth about the time that Mother Earth's environment is entirely dying, and then we won't have any choice. And maybe the atmosphere will survive, and maybe it won't.
Well, could you speak, I think, to that last sentence? I really find there's a lot of these spare few words that without freedom, there can be no morality.
Right, because the individual has the morality, and this is what I wanted to talk about, because who used to give us morality was the church, and of course, for a lot of people, me included, I had a lot of problems with that, because I never could see God as a word. Okay. Mm-hmm. For me, in the beginning was the word. Well, that's just some ink on a piece of paper. And as far as I'm concerned, the Bible is just a black doorstop, unless somebody can put meaning into it. And so I decided to start putting meaning into things. And some people here, Jordan is one of them, definitely know that I heavily underline books, and that's because I'm trying to pull out of the words what the meaning actually is. Okay, and so I'm going to provide a demonstration of this now, where Dr. Jung is talking about how we truly have to change our perception of the word God and what God is. And keeping in mind that Jung believed that each one of us has the God image within ourselves, and that God is actually the collective unconscious. And so that to include, Vladimir Putin, he's part of it. He's the dark side. And so, and Jung actually predicted this, let's see, it was over 70 years ago in a letter. And it's just one paragraph of a letter, but I turned it into calligraphy so that you can pull out what his meaning is. And so Jordan has seen this yesterday, but I'm going to pull it up one more time. And this is just an artist's proof, but here it is. Man's relation to God. Okay. And just to give you a key about my coloring, everything that's in blue is logos. Everything that's red is eros. Everything that is green is something touchable on the planet. And everything that's actually purple, it comes out as black, is either intuition, or it's something that's beyond our ken. It's metaphysical. And so the green is physical, the purple is metaphysical. And so man's relation to God probably has to undergo a certain important change. Okay. Instead of a propitiating praise to an unpredictable king, or the child's prayer to a loving father, the responsible living and fulfilling of the divine will in us will be our form of worship of and commerce with God. So in other words, it's us that's fulfilling the divine will. We each have a little piece of that, and it's our responsibility. That's what growing up is about. It's our responsibility to present that. Otherwise, we just create chaos. And so God's goodness, his goodness, means grace and light, and his dark side, the terrible temptation of power. And that's probably the most important sentence I ever read of Carl Jung's. And so I've changed this in a later version of this. The goodness means is in blue because it's a logos thing. And his is still in purple because nobody can point to God. But it means grace and light, whatever that is. And his dark side is the terrible temptation to power, which, we saw with Jesus Christ in the Bible, where he's tempted by the devil. And he says, my kingdom is not of this world. And he sends the devil away. So man has already received so much knowledge that he can destroy his own planet. So can destroy. This is a distinctive point, and one that Jung worried about throughout the latter part of his life. So man has already received so much knowledge that he can destroy his own planet. Let us hope that God's good spirit will guide, and good spirit is all in purple because it's a spirit, it's not something you can touch. And then the rest is logos here, will guide him in his decisions, because it will depend upon man's decision whether God's creation will continue. So it depends upon us to decide whether this magical, mystical thing we call Mother Earth is going to continue to serve us. Okay, and that was in a letter that he wrote in June of 1956. So comments, Jordan?
I think it's bearing the onus of the responsibility of the continuation of the original creation on us.
Absolutely. We have to grow up. We're not following the orders of an unpredictable king. When we're adult and have maturity and we've learned how to live in society, then it's up to us to make it work. And the problem we have with somebody like Donald Trump is he's trying to tear down norms that have worked for the country for 400 years. And he did tear down a lot of those. And now there's a lot of repair that has to be done, because we see
Right.
what the fault lines in our society are because of him. Okay, so maybe that has to happen every so often. Maybe not with a president, we can hope. But we can certainly see how terrible civilization and life would be if everything was for Donald Trump's purposes and not anybody else's. And we see this happening very clearly with Vladimir Putin right now.
So shall you me to continue?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Our admiration for great organizations dwindles when once we become aware of the other side of the wonder, the tremendous piling up and accentuation of all that is primitive in man, and the unavoidable destruction of his individuality in the interests of the monstrosity that every great organization, in fact, is. The man of today, who resembles more or less the collective ideal, has made his heart into a den of murderers, as can easily be proved by the analysis of his unconscious, even though he himself is not in the least disturbed by it. And insofar as he is normally adapted, adjustment and adaptation from the footnote, to his environment, it is true that the greatest infamy on the part of his group, will not disturb him, so long as the majority of his fellows steadfastly believe in the exalted morality of their social organization. Now, all that I have said here about the influence of society upon the individual is identically true of the influence of the collective unconscious upon the individual psyche. But as is apparent from my examples, the latter influence is as invisible as the former is visible. Hence, it is not surprising that its inner effects are not understood, and that those to whom such things happen are called pathological freaks and treated as crazy. If one of them happened to be a real genius, the fact would not be noted until the next generation or the one after. So obvious does it seem to us that a man should drown in his own dignity, so utterly incomprehensible that he should seek anything other than what the mob wants, and that he should vanish permanently from view in this other. One would wish both of them a sense of humor, that, according to Schopenhauer, truly divine attribute of man, which alone befits him to maintain his soul in freedom. Amen, amen to that.
Right. And so in the play that we're doing this summer, Rabbi Beck is describing the infamies of the concentration camp that he was subjected to. But in the course of that description, I'm not going to say how, because everybody will then know the secret, and we want them to come and see it. But
Well, part of the secret is actually you have to be there to experience. I mean, it's
right. You have to be there to experience it. But the point is that he tells a joke, and I've practiced this scene probably 50 times, and I have been able to laugh every single time without fail. And I don't have to force it. And so I'm delighted about that. I feel divinely touched by that fact. But Jung notes there that, even in such dire conditions, there's the possibility of laughter.
Well, and that's usually what happens with laughter is that laughter is an advanced form of training. I mean, one, it's that have such a facility with something, you're gymnastic with it. And the other way is that it just completely blindsides you, which creates that minor hysteria. But either way, it diffuses the argument into connection and communication. I mean,
Right.
If people can laugh, what I think it was Victor Borgia, laughter is the shortest distance between people, and then that's so true.
Right. And this is what Vladimir Zelensky has demonstrated to us when he said, I don't want a ride, I want ammunition.
Yeah, I don't need a ride. We need ammunition. It's like, exactly. Right. And what's good there is he sidestepped a lot of lengthy talks for diplomacy and politics. It's like, no, we don't need a ride. We need ammunition. I mean, so it wasn't let's play nice. He's like, this is serious. This is happening. I'm going to hang up the phone right now. Basically,
right. And
I have things to do.
Right. And there was an older woman on who was, and she was really old, like maybe 100 or something. And she said, since the 1930s, you've been murdering us. Why are you doing that to us? And she's quite right. It's, Ukraine has always been expendable for the Russian people, and the Ukrainians have noticed, right?
Right.
And it's very much like the Irish and the Scots vis-a-vis the United Kingdom. I'm married to. I have a son-in-law who's an Irishman, and it was really quite special to be in Southern Ireland and meet these older gentlemen that were part of our family now, and see how different they are from the British. And it's quite clear that the Ukrainians are quite different from the Russians, who won't stand up to Vladimir Putin. And
well, and the thing is too, I mean, the killing, I mean, there's no due process. It's, you're taken in the middle of the day or the night and you're never seen again. And the worst case is you actually might not be killed. You may be stuck in 30 below in Siberia in some gulag or something. And, where the people pack into one little house just so they stay warm. I mean, it's
absolutely.
It's a tragedy, honestly. It's long form. I think, who was it who said, okay, enough. You've had your fun, but it's time to stop. Who was that who recently said that?
Yeah, I don't know, but obviously the book, Boris Pasternak's book, Dr. Zhivago,
Mm-hmm.
the movie that came out in the late 60s, early 70s,
Mm-hmm.
really expressed what had happened, because the Russian intelligentsia had become quite effete, and they had all these princes and this and that, and all of a sudden they were conscripted and had all kinds of things happen to them. And Zhivago himself ended up getting sent to Siberia, or going to Siberia, I guess. So
So I have
anyway.
to say, with my background, I hope I don't teleport, because I don't know, something must be going on outside. But it's like this shoulder. It's like I may teleport here in a second.
You're not real, Jordan.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
good evening, Joel. It's nice
I've
to
got
see you.
I've got a glitch in my matrix. Joel found me out. It's like,
Yeah. So go ahead and read the footnote on page 152 then, if you'd
Certainly.
like, and we'll address that.
so footnote 8 that came from paragraph 240. Thus, it is quite unpardonable. Thus, it is a quite unpardonable mistake to accept the conclusions of a Jewish psychology as generally valid. Nobody would dream of taking Chinese or Indian psychology as binding upon ourselves. The cheap accusation of anti-Semitism that has been leveled at me on the ground of this criticism is about as intelligent as accusing me of an anti-Chinese prejudice, no doubt on an earlier and deeper level of psychic development, where it is still impossible to distinguish between an Aryan, Semitic, Hamitic, or Mongolian mentality. All human races have a common collective psyche. But with the beginning of racial differentiation, essential differences are developed in the collective psyche as well. For this reason, we cannot transplant the spirit of a foreign race in globo, would be in total, into our own mentality without sensible injury to the latter. A fact which does not, however, deter sundry natures of feeble instinct from affecting Indian philosophy and the like.
Okay, I think that Dr. Jung stepped in the yogurt on this one, okay, because first of all, this was written, let's look at when it was written. It was written in 1917. The second edition came out in 1917 in London. And the piece that he wrote, I'm going to check it, about Jewish psychology, was much later. It was 15 years later, I think. And he did, in that case, differentiate a Jewish psychology. And that is one of the major topics of our play, in that he wrote things that actually appear in Mein Kampf. And so, hold on a second.
So how are you, Joel?
Good. How are you, man?
Good. How about you?
Yes.
I don't know if I disappear here. It's like,
Let me see if I can.
how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Doing fine. Thank you very much. Good night,
Yes,
Skip.
I think it's interesting, Skip, here too. This to me was, I think, his original seed of dignity of difference, which the Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs took up as well. But where I think he was, one, a little angry here, and people were taking pot shots at him for being anti-Semitic for that statement. But I
For
think
which
he's
statement?
trying
This statement?
the footnote about, there is no Jewish psychology, he said, generally, just like there's no Chinese or Indian psychology binding upon ourselves. And I think he's taking a shot at the dignity of difference of culture, that whole in globo. I can't take on the whole globe, the whole of another world's psychology or culture without damaging it. He says the latter. So it's not me, it's the latter, because I need to not knock off the hard edges, the sharp edges. I need to understand its sharp, dull, smooth, engaging, disengaging points. And then I think later when he says, no, there actually is one, I think then that's going more into a sociological psychology, where he's starting to deal with the nature of dwelling and of culture itself in the psyche. So I think here he stepped in the yogurt from his later work, but in this one here, I think he's just defending himself in the statement that saying there was not a Jewish psychology was just as normal as saying there's not a Chinese psychology or an Indian psychology, except he did step in the yogurt, because if you live in a different place in the world, you begin to feel different. Water conforms to its cup. And I think Mark Twain said the best cure for racism is travel. Go see other cultures and don't try to change them. Go learn, go be there, because there is difference. And just for example, previously in the conversation, I mentioned the Russians that I knew were very similar to me growing up in the desert, beauty in the detail. Because, when you grow up and it's 30 below zero and you're you think that's normal, you get hardened. There's a different, nature will kill you right outside the front door. Not, oh, darn, I forgot my coat. Okay, I won't forget my coat tomorrow. It's like, no, and go back and get the coat or you'll die, and whereas, above zero, not so much, depends on your constitution. But, if I lived barefoot in Hawaii growing up, the images in my mind, the way I process visually is probably going to be different. Dr. John Jackson was talking about this, where the origins of images based on your culture and the images you see, so basically based on your influence. So I think there is a psychology to each culture that's puts a finer grain on the collective and personal unconscious.
Yeah.
So he stepped in the yogurt, I think, but he ate the yogurt and did an article years later.
Well, I have to pull out this piece.
So, Joel, have you been listening, or are you just stepping in just now?
Yes, I've been listening to you.
Thoughts on the discussion so far? While Skip's looking for that, because I think that's an important piece Skip's going to segue with. But in the meantime, what are your thoughts?
I like the expression you use it, the dignity of the difference.
Thank you. Yeah, that's one of my. That's not a dead horse, and I can't beat it enough. It's like,
I think that's all well and good. I don't think Jung's thought on this was really very good. He was very mushy on it, and
I think you're right in that sense, because he kind of here is tossing it off. It's as if he's batting a fly. I'm going to take a quick shot. Bam, bam, bam. A couple sentences later, he's done. He made a point, but I think you're right. I don't think he solidified it.
Yeah.
Basically, I think he went fishing. He hung out some bait, basically. But yeah, so Joel, the dignity and difference. It's such a concept that I've really latched onto about not how to diffuse conflict, but how not to have it in the first place. Where if something really gets me, then it's my job to listen more deeply, not to get all stirred up. And I think that's the opposite of what's happening typically that creates wars and all that, is us and them immediately goes to, Jung said it here, anything that's going to threaten the collective personality is taken immediately, primitively, and defended against, regardless of any criminal behavior, even within their own collective.
Yeah. So I'll just read this passage from the script of our play. I thought I had it in Civilization in Transition, but I can't find it at the moment. But Jung wrote during Hitler's rise, and maybe it was just before Hitler's rise, because the words that I'm going to say are actually in Mein Kampf. Okay, so Hitler obviously plagiarized these words from Jung. And so here's what he says. You wrote, and I quote, "The Jew, who is something of a nomad, who has never yet created a cultural form of his own, and as far as we can see, never will, since all his instincts and talents require a more or less civilized nation to act as host for their development." And the rabbi says, how could you write that? We Jews we're parasites, unable to create our own culture, but only living on the cultures of others. This was like something straight out of Mein Kampf. Didn't you understand how the Nazis would use your words about Jewish psychology? And so the point is that those were his words, and that is in Mein Kampf. It's not like something that came out of Mein Kampf. It's in Mein Kampf.
Right.
And I do remember reading this article about Jewish psychology. I thought it was in volume 10, but apparently I can't find it easily right now, but it's exactly those words that appear in our play. And he's being rightly challenged about that. And, if you want to know something about about shadow, this play that we're doing is entirely about Jung's shadow. And, Skip volunteered to play Carl Jung in the play. And therefore I grew a mustache for the purpose and everything. And what I realize is that throughout this play, I have to eat Jung's shadow. Every wrong, bad thing that he did in his lifetime got dropped into this play, actually. And it's very, very interesting. And there's some interesting facts in the play, which I'm not going to go into now, but come to Helena, Montana, come June, and you'll learn all about it. You have to, Joel.
I have to win the lottery first.
Huh?
So I retire.
No, you have to.
Oh boy.
You have to
I would love to.
You have to take a few days off and come see us.
Yes.
And
I'll try to do that.
Because this, especially for this play, it's going to be very powerful. But the the rest of the event is going to also be very powerful. And I'm sure there will be things from this play that you will be able to go back and use immediately in your work in the courts. I feel strongly about that. So anyway, so Jung was not lily white, and I haven't studied him for 35 years because he was lily white. I don't claim to be lily white myself, and I don't claim to be a perfectly moral person. Obviously, I'm on my second wife, so anybody that's on his second wife has to acknowledge that he's not a perfectly moral person.
Well, what I have to say about that, I think, is it reminds me of the old story about Churchill doing an interview for someone for his cabinet. And he says, "Well, sir, tell me about your vices." And, Churchill's not asking him to out him. He's asking him so he knows what kind of damage control and what kind of liquor to keep in the cabinet. I mean, and this is a question for him. And the interviewee says, well, sir, I'm an upstanding gentleman. I have no vices. And Churchill just guffaws, dying laughing. And he said, sir, either you're a liar or you're that boring, and I can have neither of those kinds of people in my cabinet. Good day, sir.
Absolutely. Well, that's the question I always ask people when I was interviewing them for jobs, which was, what's the biggest mistake you ever made?
Yeah.
Right? Because if they tell you some little mistake, then you know they're lying and they're a liar. They have to tell you about a whopper in order for, because then you know they have the maturity to handle a mistake and grow from it. And
also the global sense to understand the ramifications and consequences before, oh, this will play out, it's no big deal. They're like, no, this is smelling a little whopperish. I think we should stop and have a discussion before we go off on this one. Instead of don't blithely and idly walk in to trouble.
Right. So I see Joel very slyly.
This play is very fantastic.
Say it again.
It's fantastic. This play is fantastic. The rabbi and the analyst. The title.
Has it been translated into Portuguese?
No, because I remember that when the letters between Jung and Erich Neumann were released, this book, the School of Analytical Psychology in Tel Aviv, they promoted a seminar. And I think that the main people who are ahead of this seminar, I think that soon after they released this book, the rabbi and the analyst. But it's a deep book. When you said that this play were written on Jung's shadow, this is psychological. This is a psychological truth.
Yeah. Believe me, I know, because I'm playing Jung, and I've had some troubles with actually performing it. The first time I performed it,
my congratulations.
Well, we haven't performed the play on stage yet, but we have been working on it for nearly a year. And the first time I did a reading with my colleagues, there were a couple of times where I literally wept uncontrollably, because, well, I'm not going to tell you why, but I wept uncontrollably. And since then, I haven't done that, although I can laugh. Every time this particular joke is told in the play, I'm able to laugh. I've been able to laugh, and we've probably done that scene 50 times, but I haven't wept again. So we'll see. When we're doing practice, one of my colleagues, who's a psychiatrist, is playing Rabbi Beck. He's a retired psychiatrist, and he's in this particular scene. He's supposed to be very angry at me, right? And as soon as I started to weep, he fell back into analyst mode. And he denies that he did that, but I think that observation, which was from another psychologist that's in the group, was correct. That he went into analyst mode and he eased up on me, and I didn't want him to ease up on me because this thing is full of Jung shadow. He's sticking it to Jung throughout the play. So,
well, there might have also been the compassionate piece of knowing that he's seen Skip and not Skip playing Jung, so he backed off so as not to kick you while you're down, so to speak.
No, it wasn't that thoughtful. No. It was simply, we were reading it for the first time, and he didn't expect an actual emotional reaction to the words, and so that's a little preview for folks out there in YouTube land.
Nice.
So let's see. Did you finish now?
I finished 240, and
okay.
241 seems to be. We've got a little time. It feels like we should do 241 at least to finish this, because at 242 it segues a little bit into describing more in detail.
All right. Why don't you go ahead and read that while I take care of a few administrative details here.
Okay.
And then we may read it again next week. But I
Sounds
don't
good.
want to go. I don't want to go too much over the 10 o'clock time period.
Yeah,
so.
we've got about 6-7 minutes. So I'll just read this one paragraph as the last one. Paragraph 241. The collective instincts and fundamental forms of thinking and feeling, whose activity is revealed by the analysis of the unconscious, constitute for the conscious personality an acquisition which it cannot assimilate without considerable disturbance. It is therefore of the utmost importance in practical treatment to keep the integrity of the personality constantly in mind. For if the collective psyche is taken to be the personal possession of the individual, it will result in a distortion or an overloading of the personality, which is very difficult to deal with. Hence, it is imperative to make a clear distinction between personal contents and those of the collective psyche. This distinction is far from easy, because the personal grows out of the collective psyche and is intimately bound up with it. So it is difficult to say exactly what contents are to be called personal and what collective. There is no doubt, for instance, that archaic symbolism, such as we frequently find in fantasies and dreams, are collective factors. All basic instincts and basic forms of thinking and feeling are collective. Everything that all men agree in regarding as universal is collective. Likewise, everything that is universally understood, universally found, universally said and done. On closer examination, one is always astonished to see how much of our so-called individual psychology is really collective. So much indeed that the individual traits are completely overshadowed by it. Since, however, individuation is an ineluctable psychological necessity, we can see from the ascendancy of the collective what very special attention must be paid to this delicate plant, individuality, if it is not to be completely smothered. And he describes that individuation is a process of differentiation, having for its goal the development of the individual personality. As the individual is not just a single, separate being, but by its very existence presupposes a collective relationship, it follows that the process of individuation must lead to more intense and broader collective relationships and not to isolation.
Yeah.
And I'm glad he brings up there the individuality in regards to being in context with individuation, that the individuation actually contributes to the individuality. But I think it's important he brought it up there because a lot of people try to toss off individuation as being individualism. And that's a whole different thing than individuality. That's more of a, the inflation of the one person individualism, the one over the many. So here he feels he points to the interrelationship, the individuation and individuality. Individuality being the product, individuation being the process.
Right. And so the point is, all you out there in YouTube land, we're all different, every single one of us. None of us are the same as anybody else because we all have differences. And the question is, how can you experience completely what is you and only you? That's what Dr. Jung is talking about wholeness. Now, part of his point is that our psyche, our unconscious, is trying to tell us about that all the time. Okay, the things that come up in dreams and visions, those are not one-off events that are only come occasionally. Our psyche is actually telling us things all the time, 7 by 24 by 365. Okay, your unconscious is telling your heart to beat. It's telling your lungs to breathe. It's telling your cells to regenerate. All that is done unconsciously. But your survival, besides those things, which your survival depends on, your survival also depends on your environment. And your psyche, what Dr. Jung used to call the 2-million-year-old man, it's really the 3.5 billion-year-old man, because it's been developing since we were single-celled organisms. And since we first split off from one cell split off from another, ever since then to today, we have ancestors who have done two things successfully. They survived until they reproduced. They survived until they reproduced. That's a fact about all of our ancestors going back to single-celled organisms. Now, as we developed in the process, our psyche developed, it learned that certain things are bad, like predator. And so we need to recognize a predator. And we do recognize a predator because we get a feeling inside ourselves, wow, this guy isn't so good, or this woman isn't so good for me. I better get away from this person. Or in my case, I get the police car that comes up in as a vision every time I get near police activity. And it's just because my unconscious is picking up things that are happening in my unconscious, and it thinks, my unconscious, not my conscious self, but my unconscious self thinks of the police as predator, okay? Because the police are always trying to stop you for speeding or whatever. And so, and I don't think that police officers in general are predatory, but anyway, that's how my unconscious reacts. And that comes from a very, very deep level in my psyche. And it was probably because some ancestor millions of years ago started to recognize that there was a panther coming into my vision, and that meant danger. Okay, and that was a predator, that my awareness that there was a panther. And so my ancestors probably millions of years ago had a vision of a panther. And my unconscious in my lifetime, turned that energy into a black and white, a police car. And
you know, and I experienced that as personal radar. You know,
Yeah.
it's, you know, there's just a smell, sight, hearing, and micro hearing. I mean, things that I probably didn't audibly hear.
right.
But then
And so-
I'm aware of my environment, and you get surprised less. And you know, it's
Right.
someone
So-
breaks
so
into your house, and it's like I've
so
been
my
expecting.
point is, with respect to what you were raising in this paragraph, is that our unconscious is communicating with us 7/24 by 365.
Mm-hmm.
The reason sometimes we get dreams is because we've set our conscious mind aside, so it's not blaring out or blinding us. Okay, in other words, it's a very subtle thing, and you have to learn how to be conscious of that subtle thing, which is your unconscious. It's communicating to you behind the scenes. It's like a script prompter who's back behind the scenes of a play, and you forget your line and they whisper what your line is, right?
Right,
And,
from the little box, right?
right. And if you're blinded by some spotlight on the stage, you might not hear that, right? But that's what you need to hear in that moment in the play, because you can't remember your line, right? You don't need to see better because of the Klieg. You need to hear the prompter, right? And so,
Well, and that shows that when your sight is blottoed, sometimes you won't know to listen to hear. So
Right.
you know, it could be a moth or a bird or someone fanning themselves in the audience. You didn't notice that as a difference from the whisper. Whereas if you would have had your ear pointed to listen for your line, you would notice the resonance, the similarity for the words you're trying to remember. I mean, so
right,
yeah,
exactly. That's right. And so, so my point, and it happens a lot more than you think, because different things happen in your life. Your wife calls you, or you see something on the evening news or whatever, and it makes you think of something else. Okay. Whenever that's happening, whenever some other images is coming up in your mind, that's your psyche saying something to you. Okay. So that when, you know, when I think of Putin now, or not Putin, if I think of Zelensky right now, every time I think of him, it brings up in my mind a scene from the movie Patton. And the scene is that Patton is moving the Third Army toward Bastogne to end the Battle of the Bulge and to save General McAuliffe, who was the commander in the Battle of the Bulge. And the German leader, whoever it was in the Battle of the Bulge, had McAuliffe surrounded, and he demanded that McAuliffe surrender. And McAuliffe sent him a one-word answer, and the answer was nuts, N-U-T-S, nuts. and so Patton's aide comes up behind him, and he tells him this story. And Patton says, well, a man that eloquent has got to be saved. And so a man as eloquent as Vladimir Zelensky has got to be saved. We have to save him somehow. And not only him, but millions of Ukrainians as well. We have to find a way for that. We have to find a way for that. And we're remiss if we don't. You know, it isn't to say that we should start sinking Russian ships per se, but you know, something, you know, because that'll invite a global battle between us and Russia.
Well, I think out of 1,300 tanks in the Russian army, 294 or so. I mean, a full 25% have been destroyed.
Yeah,
I mean,
well,
I think they also began to pull back.
they all should have been turned into razor blades 50 years ago. Anyway,
Well,
so-
I saw one video and pictures afterwards, and the tank top had been blown off. It was on its side, and there was this big coiled spring that was just hanging out. And I went, "Oh my God, that's pre-ball bearing." It's like, it didn't even have ball bearings or magnets. I mean, but it was like, wow, how old is that? How many retrofits has that little piece of machinery received?
Right. So, but anyway, my point is that I got that vision, right? That every time I see Zelensky now, I remember that scene from Patton where
Right.
McAuliffe has to be saved, right? And Man That Eloquent has to be saved. And that's the way it is with Zelensky. He has to be saved. We have to, but not only him, but the whole Ukrainian people have to be saved, and we have to find a way to do it. And we have to find a way to do it that's subtle. Okay, it has to be subtle. It can't be, the Marines or the U.S. Army crashing in there and starting to throw the weight.
Yeah, and I
around.
think rather than saved, in respect to the integrity and power he's put forth, he needs allies.
Yeah, he
And
needs allies.
to aid him in him being the leader as to what he's doing. Because
Right.
the last thing I want is someone else tomfoolery to come over there, think they're all genius. He's already got helm, and so he needs aid.
Yeah.
Like you
Right,
said,
and
I
that's
don't need a ride. We need ammunition.
Yeah, and that's what that's what McAuliffe was in the Battle of the Bulge. He was going to hold out until somebody gave him the aid that he needed to win. And it was a very painful, I don't know, month or so during the Battle of the Bulge when he was surrounded. But finally, the Third Army came and saved him, and saved whatever troops were left there. But I mean, it was a war, and but my point is that my psyche accesses that vision to me. Okay.
Right.
Because I see Zelensky on TV, I think of that scene every time. And that's the way our psyche communicates with us, by these subtle things. And the question is, how do we get ourselves to pay attention to these things? It could be raised hairs on the back of your neck, or it could be a favorite piece of music or whatever, but something in your environment triggers something in your mind. You remember something, or you remember a feeling, or you remember a movie scene, or you remember something that happens to me. But that process is your psyche doing its job. Okay. And if we can start to understand that, and if we understand that, then we can understand what Jungian psychology is about.
And I think your example right there actually provided a much more simple and clear response to Emil's question earlier, as what is projection? Because when that mental image came to mind, that's a projection. But if you add someone in front of you that they bring something to mind, you don't load up the shotgun and it's oh, hey, you brought this to mind. It really angers me or whatever, but there's a discussion because like that came up for you. And so that's a really wonderful example of projection, from you to yourself, what is brought up. But that's a great way also to learn how to interact with other people when that happens.
Well, and my point is, it's happening constantly for all
right.
of us. We
live in the unconscious.
We
24/7.
live there, and we keep thinking of other things that are happening. Reminds me that we have to go to the grocery store tomorrow, whatever it is. All those things are cues from our unconscious telling us how to live our lives. And we get those cues all the time. What we have to learn is to be sensitive to them, because they're also telling us how to live our lives and what we need to do. And, for me, okay, I'm a crumpled up old Marine with three joint replacements. So I'm not going to go over to Ukraine and help Zelensky or anybody else. I mean, I would be totally useless in that. But I can talk about these points and help others understand these points so that they can apply them in their own lives.
Right.
And it's very clear that there are many Americans that have gone over to fight for Ukraine in various ways. They've gone to train, as civilians, they've gone to train or whatever it is. And they obviously were cued by their unconscious that, geez, I ought to go be there and help out with this thing.
Well, we've had kind of, I think, hit time.
Right. Okay. So Turup says, wholeness in everything when everything is immeasurable. Well, we can have a sense of wholeness. Whether we can get to the outer edges of the universe is a different question. But
I just play the always complete, never finished, lifelong game.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So Turup has a comment about the Clintons and such, which I think that's gratuitous, Turup, so I'm not going to read it. I will read that human condition is suffering under leadership caught up with propaganda, community, and individuals suffer. Okay, yeah. Every government is corrupt in some way. And, the question is, how much is too much? And, when you see a 500-foot yacht going through the Bosphorus, that's
or
probably,
a bridge being disassembled again to get
Yeah.
a certain person's yacht through from the boatyard.
Yeah. So those, those are over the top things. And I think most of us can say, well, that was probably too much corruption. Okay. You can't get all corruption out of government. As soon as you give somebody authority over petty cash, they're going to buy themselves a coffee every so often out of it, right? Even if it's,
what do you call a group of baboons?
What do you call them?
A Congress.
Oh,
that's
right.
literally. You can have like a loyalty of hummingbirds, and you can have a pride of lions, but there's a Congress of baboons. There's a whole set of groupings of animals, and that's actually nothing against our government and our Congress, but that's what baboons are called when they're in a group. Like a murder of crows, literally, it's a Congress of baboons.
Right. So JDS 13 says, I don't think I like hearing you say wound up Marine. Well, I have to just admit the truth here, right? I'm a retired Marine, and I'm very proud of that fact. And I still maintain my commission. So theoretically, the president could call me up, although they would have to make me into a desk guy in Washington, I think. And in fact, that's the last job I had in the Marine Corps, which was to be the reserve counterpart to the head of standards branch. So I was the reserve head of the branch that set all the performance standards in the Marine Corps. And but my role would be if the Marines were called out for a big battle someplace, the head of standards branch was going to go, and he was going to be an F-18 pilot, okay, because that's what his real original job was, and I would be sitting there as head of standards branch. That's the whole point of that position. But I did that for, I don't know, maybe a year and a half, and then I broke my leg, so that was the last thing I did in the Marine Corps. So once a Marine, always a Marine. And if I had to do something, I would do it, but I doubt that would ever happen, given my advanced age now. Joel, do you have any final comments before we sign off here tonight?
Jung used a phrase that I like very much when he says that psyche generates realities all the time. And this statement converges to what you were saying about the unconscious trying to communicate or communicating with us all the time. And
okay, Jordan.
That's why I
Joel,
like the
I couldn't quite hear what you were saying. Jordan, did you hear what Joel said?
I lost you, Joel. And when you said the psyche is generating realities all the time, then there was a little attenuation after that. I didn't catch what came after that.
That this statement of Jung is quite similar or about what you were saying, that the unconscious communicates with us all the time, and we just don't perceive this.
Yeah, communicates with us all the time, and we just don't perceive it.
Right. Or we don't know that that's what's happening.
Yes.
We may perceive it, but not understand its significance.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
And that's what this YouTube channel has always been about, to help people understand the significance of those aspects.
Right.
Right. And so again, like the patrol car coming up for me, that's a symbol which is very Jungian, that represents, a warning to me. It's a warning to me, okay? And, it says in a very rough way, predator, but I don't think of it as a predator. I just think of it as a speed trap.
Well, and it's funny, I hadn't thought about this till this last week, but I was driving down to a shop at the other edge of town, and out of the blue, I looked down at my dashboard and went, "Oh, I should get a radar detector again." And I just came right off the gas and got into the brakes a little bit, and no more than 75 feet later, and then poof, cop passes me and takes someone else down. Well, we were driving the same speed, and then I kind of just drifted off. But I thought about it. I went, "Thanks, Skip. It wasn't the car. If a radar detector comes to mind, I'm like, slow down. You don't need to get a radar detector. You are the radar detector."
Right. If you think of a radar detector, you probably ought to slow down.
Yeah, it's like, oh, okay. If I don't do it, I'm going to blame myself all week long. So,
right.
Yeah. But I like that, Joel. The psyche is creating realities all the time. So there's a mind movies,
Yeah. And we
right.
If we algorithm generates realities all the time also.
Right.
So I think that maybe the algorithm, if we allow it to generate realities all the time also. So I think that maybe the algorithm, if we allow it to generate realities all the time also. So I think that maybe the algorithm, if we allow it to generate realities all the time also. So I think that maybe the algorithm, if we allow it to generate realities all the time also. So I think that maybe the algorithm, if we allow it to generate realities all the time also. So I think that maybe the algorithm, if we allow it to generate realities all the time also. So I think that maybe the algorithm, if we allow it to generate realities all the time also. So I think that maybe the algorithm, if we allow it to generate realities all the time also. So I think that maybe the algorithm, if we allow it to generate realities all the time also. So I think that maybe the algorithm, if we allow it to generate realities all the time also. So I think that maybe the algorithm, if we allow it to generate realities all the time also. So I think that maybe the algorithm, if we allow it to generate realities all the time also. So I think that maybe the algorithm, if we allow it is somehow belongs to the order of the psyche.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the psyche.
A solid algorithm. Is it possible?
Of course. And but what we have to remember is that an algorithm maybe could have 300 in calculus. An algorithm could have 300 different variables, but our psyche is dealing with thousands or even millions of variables, and it's giving us the image that is relevant right now based on all those variables. So yes, you can have a artificial intelligence that can have a lot of algorithm and a lot of variables in the algorithm, but it's never going to match the human mind. Okay, it's never going to match that, because no one would ever be able to develop an algorithm that was complete. Okay, and if you did develop it, the psyche would go beyond it and change it. Okay, so
Yep.
So there's one comment here that Tara made that I do want to respond to. How do you know when you've been caught in propaganda? That's a good question. How do you know when you've been caught in propaganda? And I guess my answer is that you can't rely on anybody else to tell you. You have to know. And you know because it smells bad or something. You know, it's just your psyche just tells you this is not right. And if you're conscious enough of your unconscious, you'll know when that's happening. You know, and it used to happen to me when I was in kindergarten, believe it or not. It was very obvious to me. In kindergarten, there was this young kid who told a lot of lies. And whenever he told a lie, his eyes would go up. He would look up in a certain way. And as soon as his eyes went up in that way, I knew he was lying. I knew he was lying. And so I was attuned to that when I was 5 years old. I was in kindergarten. And I simply noticed the fact that when his eyes went up like that, I knew he was lying, and it was always true that he was lying. Right? And there were a number of incidents which I'm not going to go into now, but it was always true that he was lying, and so I was conscious of that when I was 5 years old. And so the point is that we all have antenna like that if we can become sensitive enough to our own unconscious. And so how do you know when you're caught in propaganda and you're being lied in? Well, you know, I think that the mothers of the Russian army are going to know when their sons don't return. You know.
And your question from interviews, what's your biggest snafu, you know, or what's your biggest mistake? What's the whopper? And if you look back into your life in regards to propaganda, remember the last time you did something after you heard something, and probably there was sensational language in it, you know, amazing, mind-blowing, or way too simple, but repeated over and over like a drop, you know, Chinese water torture drop. But remember what you felt like after you believed it. And that kind of minor stinky betrayal feeling of, oh, you got me. I think that's what, then if you reflect on those whoppers, you know, your whoppers, reflect on the last time, you know, actually, friends that you know, were led by the nose away by propaganda. Not what did it feel like, oh, it was hurtful, and oh, what did it smell like? What did it feel like afterwards? And then just next time you hear that, feel that, smell that, you can just look at it, raise one eyebrow, and just go, oh.
Yeah, well, you know, it's very simple. The next time you hear Vladimir Putin doing anything, are you going to believe him?
Yeah.
Who in the world is?
Well, yeah, that's the old. How did you know he was lying? Well, his mouth was moving.
mouth was
It's like-
moving, right.
His mouth was
Yeah.
moving. That's how I knew he was lying.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think that's a good analysis, a good personal analysis. Generates psychological immunity. So
Yeah.
propaganda cannot prevail.
Mhm.
no, it can. And Amila says, if it's too good to be true, it is. And
Right.
so this is the example of this is Putin believing his own bullshit and believing that he could just drive into Kyiv and have a parade and put a puppet in place in the government. He was believing his own propaganda, and it's
Mhm.
too good to be true. And
Well, they forgot to bring the socks for the puppets.
yeah, well, that's right.
I mean, they
Well-
weren't in the rations. We can't do the sock puppets anymore, so we
Right.
better turn around and go home.
Right. And so it's very clear to anybody that's been noticing, and I do notice these things, that we're prepared to do other things in the Ukraine war. The United States is preparing to do more things. And all I have to do is look out my window, if I look out the window, what I see is trees, and in the morning I'll see some deer walk by. But all I have to do is listen and look out my window, and I know that that's true. That's a true thing. Okay. I'm not saying everybody would have that, but Trump says doesn't it appear the Ukraine mainstream media is smelling a foul, trying to start World War III. No, I don't think anybody's trying to start World War III. I think that Vladimir Zelensky is trying to defend himself, and obviously he's overmatched in terms of numbers of people and weapons arrayed against him. But what is clear, and I won't say everything that I know, but what is clear just from the fact that President Biden was mentioning the buildup and what Russia was getting ready to do, and he believed that there would be attack, and most Ukrainians didn't believe there would ever be an attack. The president knew, okay, and he's been working on this for months now, okay, and so whatever you think you know, or you can predict what he'll do next, I'm sure that they're 15 steps ahead of you. Okay, I'm sure of that. And
I would agree, and I would add one more piece of the first thing about how to not get bamboozled by propaganda. Take a look and see what Fox is picking up on from the Russian stuff, and ignore that first.
that's good. Good point. Yep, good point. Yeah, and
Or what they're promoting, and you just ignore that first.
right. And so I think that Mr. Putin is overmatched, and I hope he doesn't do something stupid with nuclear weapons or with chemical weapons. In either case, that's going to be Katie bar the door, I think. And we have to pray that everybody holds their water. I mean, this is this is as tough a situation as the Cuban Missile Crisis, even worse, obviously, because there are so many people that are being killed right now who don't deserve it. And we're eyeball to eyeball with Vladimir Putin, and we're not going to lose our resolve. I know us well enough. I've been to 5 of our senior schools, and I know what we think, and we are not going to lose our nerve. So the question is, when does he, or when does somebody in his coterie take him down? It's going to have to be an inside job, but somebody's got to do that, probably.
Well, and that's the lose the nerve is one of the most important pieces. Even in an altercation between two people, whoever throws the first punch just lost, because what happens is they feel like the crowd turns against them, and now their pride is harmed, and they have to show and prove. And the quietest person in the room is still just standing there staring at them, and it's a whole big piece there. But that's to me, the first part of making chess into checkers. Don't lose your nerve. Hold the water, because you might want to drink it later,
Yeah, I'm not going to comment on all these things that Turup has to sell here. So I'm just going to call.
Well, it's a little past 8:30. I'm going to have to get going.
Yeah, me too. So thank you, Joel, for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.
Very, very glad to be here with you.
Yeah, thank
Good
you.
night.
See you
Good
soon.
night. Good night.
Yeah,
See you soon.
Montana in June. Joel.
Yeah.
See you on
Yes.
Wednesdays, Gib.
Montana in June.
Yeah, see you then.
We'll send you a hat.
Yeah, bye-bye. No, he's coming. We'll give him a hat.
No, I mean to wear, like a cowboy hat.
Right.